Good afternoon. First, a couple quotes. He who studies with a philosopher ought to learn something, being substantive each day. He ought to return home as a better human being. Seneca. I never go to bed without an hour or half hour's previous reading of something moral, whereon to ruminate in the intervals of sleep. Thomas Jefferson. Good afternoon, and welcome to our inaugural episode of the Philosophical Conversations with Thomas Jefferson, which, like one work, five questions, can be considered as part of the real Thomas Jefferson. I am today's host, George Gorey. I have served as a law enforcement officer for 35 years, 32 years with the California Highway Patrol,
So
and
might you
retired.
assume you're a cop then, George?
Yeah, I can assume that I am a
Oh,
cop. I am
okay, I
a
got it.
longtime police officer,
Longtime police officer. All right.
long time. And I served 32 years with the California Highway Patrol as a criminal and internal investigator. And I retired as a captain in 2022. So I was a police manager. And I'm currently an inspector, what we would call it's a criminal investigator for the Alameda County District Attorney's Office in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's my retirement job. My interest in Thomas Jefferson really stems from high school. But it took flight in 1995 as I read a short biography of him. And since then, I've been hooked, and I'm a big history buff. I was hooked on Jefferson. So, whether as a philosopher or historian, Dr. Holochuk's interest in Jefferson has ever been analytical. That is, to study meticulously the prose of Jefferson and flesh out its philosophical content. He also has profound interest in historiography. Much of the secondary literature on Jefferson is political and not veridical. There seems to be little interest in learning the truth about Thomas Jefferson and about the events of his day, and greater interest in using Thomas Jefferson to tackle politically sensitive issues of our time at the expense of Thomas Jefferson. So he continues to put to use his analytical skills to rectify shoddy historiography by calling out political historians. Dr. Holochuk, the Colonel, as he's affectionately called, a professor of philosophy and history, who
I
taught
think
it.
that means I outrank you, even though I'm not a legitimate colonel and you are a legitimate captain. I still somehow outrank you.
You do outrank me. That is
All right.
several ranks ahead of me. He's taught at the institutions such as the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, and Rutgers University Camden. He is author, editor of over 70 books and nearly 400 published essays, formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority and has published over 300 essays, formal and informal, and has 30 books on Thomas Jefferson. He also writes about the Ukraine. In today's episode, we discuss Jefferson's unique genius. As someone with a broad and deep a mind as any other Enlightenment thinker, he was an extraordinarily productive, mostly with his quill, for the sake of Virginian, American, and even global advancement, or so says Colonel Holochuk. He was clearly a genius, but of what sort? That is the question we address today. So I
Well
begin.
said. Well said. So glad to
Thank
have
you.
you, George. We talked on the phone a little bit, and hopefully this will be a wonderful collaboration. So welcome to the show,
Thank you,
and
Colonel.
let's start. Let's get going.
All
I
right,
love your
Colonel, here we
background
go.
there, all those badges there. I don't.
Yeah, there are all these awards that I didn't deserve, right?
And look what I
You know,
got in the background. Three
well,
clowns.
you have Bacon, Locke, and is that Isaac Newton?
Isaac Newton in back.
Fantastic. Jefferson's three greatest men. Um, so let's begin with the two quotes I selected, one from Seneca and one from Jefferson, and I'll reread them here. So the first one is from Seneca. He who studies with a philosopher ought to learn something substantive each day. He ought to return home as a better human being. And the second one is from Jefferson. I never go to bed without an hour or half hour's previous reading of something moral, whereupon to ruminate in the intervals of sleep. Can you tell us why you chose those quotes?
Well, I was reading Seneca, his letters to his disciple Lucilius, and I came across the one quote by Seneca, and I thought it was very moving. And it occurred to me, because my interest in Thomas Jefferson has almost always been exclusively, when I'm not doing historiography, concerned with his philosophical content, that Thomas Jefferson was really a philosopher of some weight, especially a moralist in the manner that Seneca was a moralist. And he was a person who, as the one quote says, I never go to bed without an hour or half hour's previous reading of something moral, whereupon to ruminate in intervals of sleep. That's a very important quote because it always suggested to me that Jefferson always had to read something for moral improvement. And it also suggests that he woke perhaps often in the middle of the night. And when he would wake, he would think about the quote. Most people don't do that. They don't read something morally inspiring, but that was a habit he had all of his life. And I used to teach Aristotle, Plato, Seneca, Epictetus, Epicurus, and a lot of the ancient philosophers that he loved. And their works are very, very moving. Even Plato, whom Jefferson execrated. So in effect, what we have been doing, and I think we talked about, you agree with this, we've been having throughout all these shows a philosophical conversation with Thomas Jefferson. We have an opportunity to watch the show and learn from Thomas Jefferson as a moral figure. And we have an opportunity to walk away, as Seneca said, as to learn something substantive. We have an opportunity with each show, in some manner speaking, reflecting upon what Jefferson said, to be a better human being. That's why I chose the quotes, and that's sort of motivation for this offshoot of the real Thomas Jefferson called Philosophical Conversations with Thomas Jefferson. I should say briefly, my last book that I just finished is called uh, Letters of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson Philosophical Conversations. So the motivation, I like that title a lot. And the motivation for this aspect of the show is we're really talking about a philosopher, a very important philosopher, in my estimation, as a moral figure. I love the guy. You do too. So that's the motivation for that.
Can you
But
give us a can you give us a definition of genius, quote unquote genius, to ground our conversation?
yeah, as I alluded to already, I think we're using talk of Jefferson as genius for a springboard for something else about which I'd like to talk. But starting off with Samuel Johnson, who gives us the Dictionary of the English Language in 1755, the definition of genius hasn't changed. I mean, the definition that Samuel Johnson gives is really the definition you find in modern lexicons today. Genius can be an attendant spirit of a person, a place. We can talk of the genius of an ancient Greek temple, of Apollo, a temple of Apollo in Greek antiquity. Second definition is genius can be a strong leaning or inclination, that someone who's a good drawer has a genius for drawing. It just means he's very talented or has a strong inclination toward doing it well. Third definition is a particular, distinctive, or identifying character or spirit, something that, I will use genius to pick out an epithet, like we're doing here. Is genius really a word that typifies Thomas Jefferson? That's what we're trying to answer. If you had one word to capture Jefferson, would you say genius? Right? So it's something that captures his essence. And the fourth definition is really the definition we use today, I think, most often when we talk about, marked aptitude, high levels of intelligence, where someone separates himself, herself from other people just by having what we would call a superbly high intelligence quotient, right? Which Jefferson certainly had. Remember the great quote from John F. Kennedy when he had a bunch of award winners in the White House, and he says this is the greatest assemblage of intelligence in the White House ever to dine in the White House, except when Thomas Jefferson dined alone,
That's
which
a
is a
great
cute
comment.
quote. It was a great kind. It shows the high intelligence of John Kennedy to be able to come up with something like that. But I think we think of a genius as Bacon in back, Locke in back of me, and then right in back of me, Isaac Newton might be considered maybe the greatest genius of all time, who came up with the universal law of gravity. Gravity is a force such that it's equivalent to the mass of one body, you know, uh, next to the mass of another body. So if I understand the mass and over the distance squared, so that the attractive force of these two bodies is quite considerable when close, and over the distance squared, as I separate them, the attractive force diminishes very, very rapidly, very rapid. So he comes up with these laws of the law of gravity and the laws of F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, and two other laws applicable to bodies. And you know, following upon people like Bacon and I wouldn't say Bacon, Locke, but those are Jefferson's people. But following people like Kepler and Galileo, you tend to think of Newton as this extraordinarily gifted person who's focusing on a problem and he solves the problem. What about all the people who fail to solve the problem? Are they not geniuses? We tend to think of genius too, I think at least, as someone who addresses a problem and is successful. Now, was Jefferson like that? I don't think so. I have argued with you that Jefferson was more of a genius insofar he was a productive genius, not what's a word I could use to typify someone like Galileo who discovers the law of falling bodies. He was more like Thomas Edison, who just persevered every day. He had the great quote that genius is more perspiration than inspiration.
Right. That's a great quote too.
And it's very true. The more you work, the harder you study, the more brilliant you seem to become. And Thomas Jefferson was like that. He had an extraordinary aptitude for study that other people, just never had. Couldn't. Patrick Henry tried to read one of Jefferson's books and borrowed a book from Jefferson and brought it back. He said, I can't get through this. And Jefferson sort of smiled and thought, Jefferson just had an extraordinary library and he used it all the time. And he just had a thirst for knowing everything that was of any interest to human beings. He didn't tackle any one problem necessarily. He tackled many problems that might be considered to be smaller in weight, but yet his life was just a dedication, as we've talked about prior to going on air, to better humankind, to better his Virginia, to better his family, to better the young federation of states, and to better the world through his interest in science. Now, I'll just say, so was Jefferson, a genius in the fourth sense? In what sense was he a genius? Not in the last sense of just applying himself to a particular problem, persevering and solving it, but he was he was a productive genius. And I'll just list some of the things he did. This is a list that, I've shared with you. Author of the Summer Review in 1774 of the Rights of British America, which is we did a show on this, a very vitriolic indictment of King George III. He was, as a member of the Continental Congress in 1775, thereafter, he was a member of at least 30-something committees and gained a reputation for being a very brilliant young man with a very fluid pen. He co-authors in 1775 the Address on Taking Up Arms with John Dickinson, drafts a constitution for Virginia. It wasn't adopted, but he drafted a whole constitution for a state in 1776. Authored the Declarations of Independence, 1776. Starting in 1776, after the Declaration, he withdraws back to Virginia to start on rewriting completely all the laws of Virginia. Jefferson was a lawyer prior to being a politician. He was well read and understood all the laws. So he drafted on a committee of 5 that was reduced to 3, 126 bills to renovate or change all the laws of Virginia. He was governor of Virginia starting in 1779 to 1781. He was a member of the American Philosophical Society, as well as a future president, right? And he had many ideas related to science. So he was a sort of an amateur scientist as well. He was minister plenipotentiary to France, 1784, 1789. So he's involved. Writes the Notes on the State of Virginia, 1787, gets published. Secretary of State, first Secretary of State under George Washington, 1790, 1793. He collects and preserves over the decades the Virginian laws, So he's collecting the laws so he can preserve and capture our history. Becomes vice president under John Adams. He authors the Kentucky Resolution 1798, which addresses some of the problems in the Adams administration. Becomes president for 2 terms starting in 1801. Writes what I think is his most brilliant piece, his first inaugural address. I love that. He goes to war with the Tripolitan pirates in 1802. He births West Point Military Academy in 1802. Just a couple more. He's the moving force behind the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. He sanctions the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804. So he's always interested in studying land and expanding the country to the west. He puts in place his Embargo Act in 1807, which had some disastrous consequence. And last, he founds the University of Virginia, roughly around 1814. So here's a guy who has a lifetime of, these are all deeds that are not benefiting him, but benefiting other people, right? So he's not a genius insofar as he's absorbed with a particular problem. He's engaged in this problem and he wants to solve it. In a Newtonian sense or Galilean sense, but he's someone who's a productive genius who's always got to keep his mind engaged, whether he's studying language, he's studying archaeology, he's studying physics, but he had a history of political participation, which was extraordinary, unmatched by probably any other president that I can think of. So, so was he a genius? Yeah, he was a genius. That's pretty obvious. But as we get on to the questions, I'll shift the focus towards something else.
It's kind of like we had said before the show when we were talking that his life was his part of his genius was, I mean, I think is that his life had a purpose, a great purpose in life, which is something many people don't have.
Yeah, you made that point. I just think it's a very good point. It's easy to get up. I feel the same way. I'm not a religious person or anything. I don't think I die, I'm going to heaven or hell. There is no heaven or hell for me, but that's neither here nor there. But in talking about Jefferson and writing on Ukraine, in a very strange way, I feel blessed to have a great purpose in my life. I love Thomas Jefferson. I think he's a person that cared so much about other people. And his list of deeds shows that. So I think your comments well taken.
Absolutely. Okay. Was Thomas Jefferson, an ideologue, as many scholars assert? They often contrast him with Hamilton or Madison, and they focus on Madison as being grounded, and Thomas Jefferson as kind of a pie in the sky.
Well, I always disagree with that. It's very convenient for scholars to paint people in polar terms. Jefferson and Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison are conveniently done. Sometimes Jefferson and Adams. And, it's a convenience for a historian to do something like that, but these conveniences are seldom very accurate, right? Just like analogical reasoning. I use an analogy to understand things, but analogical reasoning seldom is very, very helpful. When I want to draw an analogy to help me understand something, sometimes I need analogical reasoning. Well, the point I was going to make is that we try to understand the atomic model. What is an atom? How do electrons and protons interact? One way to think of it is like a mini solar system. And it helps us in some sense understand, but the real understanding begins mathematically. And so the notion of a miniature solar system to help us understand, atomic structure and everything is very limited and very unavailing for people who really know what they're doing. Anyways, I want to say he was not so pie in the sky. There's this story about the first philosopher, Thales, right? Greek philosopher, that he was so intent on looking up in the sky, and as he's walking, fell into a well. And they said, this philosopher is just so high in the sky, thinking about things in the heavens and so forth, that he can't see what's right under his feet. Was Jefferson like that? Yeah, to some extent, perhaps. But he was pie in the sky, but he was an optimist and he was an empiricist. I think he was very well grounded. What people criticized him for was his optimism. He was a very sanguine person. I think that's a very silly thing to be about which to be critical. Um, he tended to be perhaps overly optimistic about a lot of things. For example, the moral sense, and I've been critical on that. The notion to which republicanism could be grounded in American society, perhaps in France and the world. But that optimism, I think, really gives us hope every day to wake up in the morning to reading a philosopher like him who is optimistic, who thinks highly of human beings, even if he's wrong. Um, it gives us hope. It really gives us hope. I'll read one quote from James Curry and I'll end the question. In 1785, he writes to James Curry, I can persuade nobody to believe that the small facts which they see daily passing under their eyes are precious to me at this distance, much more interesting to the heart than events of higher rank. To the heart means to the moral sense. Political events are scarcely interesting to a man who looks on them from high ground, from a distance. There is always war in one place, evolution in another, pestilence in a third, interspersed with spots of quiet. These checkers shift places, just like checkers on a board, but they do not vanish, so that to an eye which extends itself over the whole earth, there is always uniformity of prospect. So the idea being Jefferson as a philosopher, as standing back and looking at everything, thought that things really never change. Pestilence, war, disease, plague, people celebrating, happy, whatever. He was the sort of person that liked to step back every once in a while to gain perspective, but he was immersed in life, which I think is the right way to live your life, is to find, to have, you mentioned purpose.
Mhm.
I mean, being a police officer, did that give you purpose? Did that give you the sort of,
Absolutely. Focus and purpose, to do something for to society, to give back in my own way.
okay? And I think, you mentioned the point that he was a purposive person. He was a person who really, and I agree with that. I just think he had every reason. I do. I can't sit in my bed because I have stuff to do. I don't know how you are, but I have to get up
The same
because,
way.
yeah. So if anyway, I mean, I'll end it with that. He just was so. I mean, I had at one point I had a criticism of one of my books on Jefferson by a person who said, "Well, the person who's writing this really knows Thomas Jefferson very well, but he's so immersed in particulars. There's so much detail. It's just going to be a turnoff to readers." And I thought, for God's sakes, as a professor, I always taught my students is that whenever you want to write something fantastic, you wallow in the details. You don't stay at the surface because everybody does that. You want to do something. If I want to write about Jefferson's notes on Virginia, I need to get immersed in, say, the mathematics, with Jefferson in mathematics. If I want to focus on something like that, and just do it in a way that no one else has ever done it, so that whoever wants to write about Jefferson and notes on Virginia has to read your book. And if I make mistakes, they have to read the book and disclose my mistakes. And it's okay to make mistakes. That's why I always say I would rather be relevant than right, meaning I want people to have to read my books. My books contain errors like other books. I make mistakes when I study Jefferson. It's okay as long as other people feel the need to read my work and correct my mistakes. I'm making a contribution. So I think that I end with that quote because Jefferson was a very engaged, immersive person. And I think that'll take us to the last question, hopefully.
And you made a really great point there that details are important, whether it be police work or especially for philosophy. Details are important. They actually mean
Well,
things, even when you don't
as
think
a
they do.
police officer, for God's sakes, everything you're doing is detail, right? Oriented.
Attention to detail. Yeah, everything you do. And I think when you look at history and philosophy like you teach and the books you have written, one of the things I love about the books is that they include much detail and they make understanding Thomas Jefferson, and I thought I understood him fairly well, much easier actually as you read through it. But you have to have the patience for that. You have to have the mind, the patience for the details. And I think sometimes in our fast-paced society, people lack that, I think. But overall,
Excellent
I mean,
point. I mean, look, to be able to understand someone like Jefferson, you made the point, I never thought of that, but it takes patience. He's
much
a
patience.
detail-oriented person. If you read his notes on Virginia from cover to cover, most people will fall asleep after, they get the second query because he's immersing himself. So you have to, what I did in my critique of it is I look at it from above. I studied the structure of it, how he arranged everything, try to have something to say about its structure, but then you go into the certain details and try to understand how everything is overall related. But I mean, he's a very detail oriented person. He's very anal.
Very
And
much so.
you have to be that sort of person to understand him. And you have to be patient if you want to be Jefferson scholar. That's why they write about racism and Sally Hemings. I don't need patience to write about that kind of shit.
Precisely. Yeah, you don't.
All right. Last
That takes
question.
us to our third question. I want to revisit this notion of quote unquote engagement. I would like you to say a little bit more on it. He asserts, for instance, Jefferson, that he was a disciple of Epicurus, and you assert that he was a Stoic, not Epicurean. So, can you explain that?
Well, I'll read Jefferson's letter to William Short, who was his former secretary while he was in France, minister plenipotentiary. 1819, October 31, he says, writes to William, and you say of yourself, I too am an Epicurean. Jefferson goes on, I consider the genuine, not the imputed doctrines of Epicurus as containing everything rational in moral philosophy which Greece and Rome have left us. Epictetus, who is a Stoic, indeed has given us what is good of the Stoics, all beyond of their dogmas being hypocrisy and grimace. Their great crime was in the calumnies of Epicurus and misrepresentations of his doctrines, in which we lament to see the candid character of Cicero, Latin Cicero, engaging as an accomplice. The merit of his philosophy is in the beauties of his style. He goes on to say later in the letter, I have sometimes thought of translating Epictetus, the Stoic, for he has never been tolerably translated in English, of adding the genuine doctrines of Epicurus from the Syntagma of Gassendi. The Syntagma of Gassendi is written many decades and many centuries after Epicurus dies, and they do not contain the genuine doctrines of Epicurus. They are a Christianized, Stoicized version of Epicurus, and Jefferson ought to have known that because he had real Epicurus's doctrines that come up to us in his library, but apparently he didn't really pay much attention to that as they come down to us today. The problem with Epicurus believed in, this is why Jefferson can never be an Epicurean. Epicurus preached a simple life like the Stoics. But he preached withdrawal from social and political affairs. He had his garden just outside of Athens, and members of his garden, his disciples, would go on and behave like Epicureans. Epicureans really believed in ataraxia, mental tranquility. You don't put into your mind worries and troubles that concern you, and you live in such a way rather simply. If I'm hungry and thirsty, I drink water and eat bread, maybe some cheese, instead of eating gourmet or delicious foods, which will taste good going down, but will trouble the stomach later on. And when the stomach is troubled, the mind is troubled. And I don't worry about things. So I practice ataraxia, calmness of mind in Greek. And insofar as that's what Epicurus preached, that's fine. And Jefferson believed that. But Epicurus also strongly believed in withdrawal because when you engage in social political matters, you corrupt yourself. You put yourself in a position to be corrupted by everything that is socially grounded. And Jefferson was not into withdrawal. He was into, we talked of this before, what I think captures Jefferson is not genius, but engagement. He was a beautifully engaged person who was integrated into a social setting. And like the Stoics, he believed not in shunning your duty, Look at the list of all the things I've given you that he's done. University of Virginia, all the stuff he did with under the Washington administration, Secretary of State. He was engaged. He was. I didn't put into the list that he was a. He headed a patent office under at
Right.
Washington's permission. So he was doing so many different things. Not all these things were done for the sake of improving his station, his situation, or for monetary reward. I mean, never talked about that. He was also a person who was very generous. If you look at his everyday journal of his expenses and so forth, you constantly see when he's talking about expenses and this and that, you'll see every so often and very often gave such and such to such and such. It's poverty. He's giving money away to people who need it, right? To charities. He believed he was a very charitable person. No one talks about that when they talk about his racism and his sexism and whatever they talk about. He was a very charitable person. He was a Christian in that sense of the manner. He was engaged. Epicureans preached disengagement, withdrawal. Jefferson never anywhere talks about withdrawal. He could never be considered an Epicurean because of that. Um, I mean, yeah, there's more I could say from the letter, but I think that's really all I want to talk about that. I think he's not an Epicurean. So, I mean, we start off talking about was Jefferson a genius? And I think it leads me, if we want to, one of the definitions of genius is something that gets at the essence of a person. And my argument is, okay, let's use that definition of genius to try to come up with a word that captures the essence of Jefferson. And that is not genius. He could give a damn about the plaudits
Right.
of intellectual concerns and achievements, but he was a generous person. And I think engagement, and when we talk about engagement, it's social political engagement, captures the genius of Jefferson. So was he a genius? No, he was not a genius in so far. He was a genius in a very obvious sense, but the genius of Jefferson lies in his engagement, his generosity. I mean, you have anything to add to that? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, when I've the books I've read over the years, the last 30 years, and yours in particular, really bring that out in him. As you kind of went in there and you used the details to dissect his personality. And I remember in listening to one of your videos prior that you talked about to get to know Jefferson, you have to engage in the letters. Oh, there's Jefferson. Hey, buddy, that you have to engage. You have to read his letters, and I've read a lot of his letters. Not probably not as many as you for sure, but I've read a lot of them. And I used to always discount these modern historians that castigate him and denigrate him because I actually read his writings. And you had mentioned in several of them to take him at his word instead of
yeah,
deconstructing somebody. So I take him at his word, and his word usually matched his deeds. Occasionally he was inconsistent, if you want to call it that, but all human beings are inconsistent at times, right? So I don't find that as a grave crime to be inconsistent once in a while in your life.
yeah. No, I think that's right. That's where you and I see eye to eye. You made the point earlier, and I'll go back to that. It's hard work to be a Jeffersonian scholar. I've said this and I believe it. This is where the people who write on him don't get him because they don't know Greek. I've studied Greek, I've studied Latin, and I've translated, Greek and Latin, Aristotle, Plato, and Epicurus and Seneca. My Greek and Latin skills have diminished over the decades, but still I can understand and I can read Greek and Latin and understand fairly well what's going on. But he was so much of his personality was formed by reading ancient historians and philosophers,
Mm-hmm.
Cicero, Tacitus, and other people. Not to read these people is just you can't understand Jefferson. And if you've never read Newton, I've read his Principia Mathematica, his principles of mathematical philosophy, where he comes up with, he explains what gravity is and so forth, comes up with this law of gravity, three laws, ancillary laws. And I've had a whole class on Galileo. I've just read a lot of Galileo's works. I've read a lot of his books. The stuff that Jefferson read and recommend it. You have to read that to it's not easy to do. It's fun for me because I, like Jefferson, and probably like you, being a cop. Let me use the crude word cop, because I'm a crude person. But you're detail oriented. You're used to that, and it's only by doing that dirty work that you can make any headway to understanding a guy like Jefferson.
That's the absolute truth. I mean, I look at people and they come up with all these suppositions of what he meant, and they deconstruct his words, and I don't read Greek or Latin, but I have read his letters, and I read the philosophers. I looked through the University of Virginia when he was proposing it, the types of educational materials he wanted, and I've started to read Seneca in English, of course, and it is very edifying to read. But it makes sense that what you say is that is the building blocks of him, of what made him who he was, the moral philosophy that he had. We have about almost 2.5 minutes left. Is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't. I
In
mean, I
that?
think you covered everything, and I like some of the points you made about the work has to be put in to understand Jefferson. I want to add that. I want to emphasize that. And why don't you tell us? You're going to be responsible for what we talk about next week, right? What are we doing
Yes.
next week? Before we
So next week we're going to talk about a particular letter. It was a July 12th, 1816 letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote back to Samuel Kercheval. And in that letter is where he discusses his idea of republican government, the ward republics, um, the generational, the idea that one generation cannot bind another. And it's a multifaceted letter. And so, although it is about republicanism, I think we talked when we on air before, it has a lot of other aspects to it, I think, that we can really explore because it's a huge letter and it's incredibly diverse. And
Yeah,
that was going to be
it's
our
a good
next one.
choice. Initially, I thought it would be bad to go back and revisit that and just crambe repetita in Latin, warm up old hash. But there's so much going on in that letter. Why not make it just the focus of a whole show? And that would be really kind of cool to do. It'll be another one word, 5 questions. So we are all set here. I think we're ready for next week. And I want to thank you for joining us. And you want to be a staple of the show hereafter, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm all in. I really
I'm,
enjoy it, actually.
I welcome. I just sort of envious. I need a background like you have, but I don't have any awards I can put up there. Maybe citations. In my younger days, I did get thrown in jail 3 times. Does that count for something? And
Why not?
when I was a bawdy drunken, well, I still am bawdy and drunkard. So anyway, all right, George, thank you very much for joining
Thank you,
us.
everybody.
I say to everybody, TTFN, talked out for now. We'll do it again next week when we look at the letter to Samuel Kercheval. Bye bye.